years ago, when I first started speaking publicly on just how harmful Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was to not only so-called Black Americans, but America at large, the pushback that I would get was largely predicated on the fact that all of us have been indoctrinated to believe that King's legacy is great, that the civil rights movement was great and a milestone for America, because we got that indoctrination ever since we were children. In our education system, we get it in entertainment, we get it from politicians,
Dr. King,
both left and right.
Luther King Jr.
And so to say that the whole thing was a ruse and that it was a detriment is just jarring to a lot of people. This is why it was necessary for me to direct the MLK project and to do it in a form of a docu-series where I'm able to lay out episode by episode the facts of what actually happened in our history. We just released episode 7 this weekend, and the comments show me that the work is paying off. Kimberly Rose says, "These are so good. Every time an episode ends, I wish there was more." James said that this is the most disturbing episode yet. MLK was a wolf in sheep's clothing and spiritually abused so many people. Kurt said, "Excellent work. So thorough. It is stunning to see the level of communist penetration into the civil rights movement. It was horrible to watch him look into those cameras and lie about communists and the movement. I see him so different now. I have known for a long time that our society had been penetrated by communism, but I thought it was mainly through the universities. What I have learned here has opened my eyes. The legislation born out of this movement has been so crippling to the poor, and the ideas behind the legislation that has crept into the national conscience has created generations of youth who think the world owes them something. Excellent scholarship. I enjoy it so much. I am promoting it at church and at work." Christine said, "This was a turning point segment for me. Every lingering question I have ever had about MLK has now been answered. How? Because I just watched him tell bold-faced lies to that reporter. We have been snookered, but I'm starting to feel free at last. Pun intended." Courtney says, "Chad, you have created such a visually beautiful documentary, as well as a painfully true documentary. Thank you." So like I said, episode 7 is now available. You can go watch it by visiting chadojackson.com. I must reiterate that this docuseries does not exist to try to provoke people to hate King the man, but rather it is an act of obedience. It is, after all, the scriptures that tell us to test every spirit to see if it's of God. And it also tells us in Ephesians not to participate in darkness, but to expose it. And King was a purveyor of darkness insofar that he used the guise and the mask of Christianity to push Marxist philosophy. It is also in keeping with the words of Benjamin Franklin, who said that we have a republic if we can keep it. And unfortunately, when you look at King and the work of the civil rights movement, it worked to undermine our constitutional republic, not to advance our constitutional republic. For those of you who unfortunately believe that King advanced our constitution, I challenge you to watch this docuseries. I am doing a live stream Q&A tonight on Patreon for those of you who are top tier Patreon subscribers. I'd love to get more of your guys' feedback if you watched any of the episodes, so feel free to comment below so we can interact. And other than that, I will see you all tonight. I love you and God bless. We've come now to a time in the season to pull together some key dots from the episodes. You'll remember in episode 2, we explored how Charles Spurgeon, who was known then as the Prince of Preachers and a master orator, stood as a mighty obstacle against Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in London. While Marx plotted revolution, Spurgeon was across town preaching redemption through Christ and salvation, not class struggle and revolution. His sermons exposed the emptiness of Marx's materialism. His pulpit became a fortress for biblical truth, one the early Marxists could not penetrate. And so Marx and Engels' followers learned a very important lesson. If they couldn't penetrate the church from the outside, they had to infiltrate it from within. If they couldn't sack the Prince of Preachers, they had to create their own. A stoic yet energetic orator who would preach not the biblical gospel, but a man-made social gospel. By the mid-20th century, that plan had matured. Enter Martin Luther King Jr., a young preacher's kid from Atlanta. The approved narrative tells us that he was a devout reformer, a man chosen by God to lead America toward peace, justice, and racial harmony. But that couldn't be any further from the truth. King's theology came not from the Bible or from regenerative teachings that are grounded in Scripture, but from apostate theologians in the lecture halls of leftist seminaries. At Crozer Theological Seminary and Boston University, professors who rejected the inerrancy of Scripture taught King to pervert Christianity through the lens of social change, just like Walter Rauschenbusch. And by the way, King believed that all the other world religions were just as useful in achieving this change.
I happen to feel that God reveals himself in all of the great religions of the world, and there is truth in all.
It wasn't that he didn't know any better. We know, according to his very own papers, that King explicitly rejected what he called, quote, the fundamentalist line of Christianity, unquote, which he was taught in his formative years. Some of his professors even helped him plagiarize some of his academic work, pushing him through the system because they saw in him what they called, quote, usefulness, unquote. As Morton Ensslin wrote in his letter of recommendation, King was entirely free of those somewhat annoying qualities common among black ministers. That statement alone reveals manipulation rather than admiration. In episode 5, we saw how Marxist tacticians like Stanley Levison and Bayard Rustin counseled King as they took the so-called struggle from class warfare to race warfare.
As a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
With King's help, they saw that they could use the language of righteousness and the image of faith to advance a very different kingdom. Not God's kingdom, but Satan's. And I say that not hyperbolically, but rather from the perspective that the treatment of human beings under the communist system, which is revealed in books like Danzak Belbev's Drawings from the Gulag, or Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, can reasonably be described as hell on earth. Stanley Levison became one of King's closest advisors, helping craft his speeches, shape his image, manage his finances, and pay his salary. Through Levison, King was connected to a network of communist organizers who understood how to turn moral authority into political power. And so, by the late 50s, the plan that had once failed in Spurgeon's London was reborn in America. Only this time, the pulpit was not resisting Marxism, it was echoing it. The revolution now wore a clerical collar. The language of the gospel had been reimagined as the language of social justice. In episode 7, we'll continue pulling back the curtain on King's transformation, examining how Levison and Rustin shaped his public persona and used the tactics of persuasive language. We'll continue to look at how Marxist theory was deceptively cloaked in biblical language, and how the new Spurgeon, Martin Luther King Jr., who they called the moral leader of America, turned the spiritual battlefield into a political one. Because to understand the civil rights movement, we must see not just the marches in the streets, but the behind-the-scenes manipulative maneuverings of a sinister conglomerate in the biblical gospel that they replaced with a Marxist one. Here's episode 7. One of the fellow communists who Stanley had a very strong connection with was Joseph Filner. Joseph Filner helped raise over $100,000 for Martin Luther King and the SCLC.
This is the destination of the Freedom Riders, the railroad station in Jackson, Mississippi.
Filner also funded the so-called freedom rides, sit-ins, and other agitative tactics connected with the civil rights movement. College-age so-called freedom riders sitting in, these weren't organized and strategized by Martin Luther King. They were organized by the likes of Stanley Levison and Joe Filner, who, by the way, had a son named Bob Filner, who was also a so-called freedom rider.
They didn't want the Civil Rights Act. They didn't want us freedom riders down here. But we made them take those civil rights bills. They did it because of us.
Dad had these Sunday breakfast meetings all the time. I remember Stanley Levison being at these Sunday gatherings a lot.
In a 2013 book interview with the sympathetic author Ben Kamen, Bob Filner spoke of his dad and Stanley Levison's communism in relation to the civil rights movement.
Dad and Stanley knew that their communist backgrounds were risky for King, but they just believed so much in